I want to thank you today for taking your time to celebrate and to have some understanding about World Autism Awareness Day. I want to give you a little bit about the program first, then I'll follow up with how we started with World Autism Awareness Day, and then we'll begin our program. The Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions was the brainchild and the passion of former Congressman Bill Young. Congressman Bill Young wanted to make sure that our community understood what government could and could not do for you. He sought to enhance, educate, and engage the community with nonpartisan responsibilities and discussions about political, social, and economic thought processes. It's our goal at the Institute to educate you and to promote issues that are important to you so that we can talk to our leaders about these issues. I'd like to talk a little bit about the background and history of Autism Awareness Day. I'm a parent of an autistic child, and it has been quite a journey. Along my road and journey, there's been many friends and colleagues and peers who have asked what it's like to parent an autistic child and what that feels like and the journey and the challenges. And so over the time period that I've been with St. Petersburg College, we've had 5 years of celebrating World Autism Day. About 3 years ago, we decided to formalize it with Mark Duran, who's a scholar at the University of South Florida. Last year, we had Vicki Westra, who is an icon and a person who is known for promoting autistic, a promotion from those who are aging out and need quality care as they're learning to enter into the workforce environment. We also had over the years Kim Strickland, who used to work with kids and had a beautiful little dog that she would allow to help with therapies for kids. And so it's just been a pleasure over the years to just really teach and shine light on this issue. So that's the history. We have a speaker who is having some technical challenges right now, so we're going to flip the script and put that person, Martha Lenderman, on the back of the program. And so we're going to start with our lead seminal speaker, who I'm just happy to introduce. Her name is Haley Moss, and for many people, she needs no introduction. She is the first autistic person to pass the Florida bar, and as an attorney, I can't say how proud I am of her journey. She has been on many television shows and written several books about her journey. The most important thing that I guess I'm so impressed with her about is that she is able to identify what her challenges are, succinctly explain them, and explain the importance of embracing the autistic community from an economic and a social perspective. So I know I could have done a better job of introducing you than Ms. Lenderman could, but of course we'll have her later in the program to talk about the challenges with the Baker Act. But Haley, I'm just so proud of you and so thankful that you're giving us your time today. With that, Ms. Haley Moss.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. It is an honor to be here with you and celebrate on this World Autism Awareness Day. I think it's really exciting that we are having this program, and thank you for everyone at home who's joining us virtually. It is an absolute pleasure to get to celebrate with you all. So I want to talk today about autism in the workplace as well as my own journey, because these are the things that are really important. And like Kimberly mentioned, that autism does come with both a social perspective and an economic perspective. And for those of you who are in the business community, whether it's in the St. Petersburg and Tampa area or even throughout the world, I am in South Florida. So this is something that affects all of us, and it's really exciting to get to do it. So without further ado, let's have a nice discussion about autism, personal journeys, and neurodiversity at work. So I always like to start with kind of an opening statement. I like to kind of phrase a lot of my presentations a lot like making a legal argument, because I am a lawyer, and it's really fun to kind of give the case of why this stuff actually matters, because it matters just outside of Autism Awareness Day, right? So awareness is something that when you are an autistic person isn't really a thing, because this is your life 24/7. So we're going to make the case that this should be something we're thinking about all year long, and not just today. Today is just a wonderful opportunity to learn. So I was diagnosed with autism when I was 3 years old. I am the kind of person who was nonverbal, so I wasn't talking, but I was also completing large jigsaw puzzles at the time. I wasn't socially engaged. I was actually kindly asked to leave preschool because I wasn't talking or anything, but I was also completing these puzzles, I wasn't coloring inside the lines, which is pretty funny considering I am an artist at this point in my life. I've always loved to draw and paint and do things that are really creative. And I really struggled socially. So all the other toddlers would be playing together and I wasn't really one of them. So those are kind of the things that we saw early on with me. And I also, like I mentioned, was one of those kids that cried and screamed a lot. So you don't have to tell me, but we're going to pose a hypothetical here. Is how many of you have been to, say, the grocery store, maybe Target, Walmart, Publix, whichever place you choose to buy your groceries, and even in the middle of these very confusing times, maybe not right now, but in your life, and you're in line, and there's a kid who is crying and screaming, kind of like the kid in the picture here, and you are thinking that that parent can't control their kid. I was that kid. And it wasn't that my parents couldn't control me, and I like to make this point really clear because it shows how we make snap judgments really quickly. So for me, I would always get overwhelmed as a kid when I was in grocery stores and places like that because it was so loud, it was so crowded. You could just imagine the blur of fluorescent lights and the clattering of the carts and all the different visuals that are going on in a place like that between all the different aisles and choices, that it's a very overwhelming situation, and it could be a lot. So when you see a kid who's crying or screaming in a grocery store, I want you to take a minute to think that maybe it isn't the parent's fault. Maybe it's not the child's fault either, that maybe it's just a very difficult situation. I bring this up because it's something that I think about a lot in terms of, how I view someone isn't always what I think it is. It's not always that this parent is not doing a good job. It could be there's something going on that I'm not thinking about. And I think about that now very consciously because I was that kid. And when you're that kid, you're not thinking about the fact that you're distracting other people. You're thinking that this is a really difficult situation and I would really like to get out of here. And when you're an autistic kid and you are a family, you kind of have to put together a village of people. So when I say a village of people, I'm thinking about teachers, family, occupational therapists, specialists, employers at some point. So everyone knows it takes a village to raise a child, but it takes an even bigger village to raise a child with a disability generally. So not only that, you're having all these different specialists, you have to find people that are accepting. It's kind of a very cumbersome task, and I really do give so much credit to my parents as well for all that they do and for assembling a village of people that were on Team Haley the entire time. So I think that's kind of how to see it, is team whoever you are or your kid is. So Team Haley was very, very large, and I'm grateful that my village now continues to grow. And it might not be the same specialists and stuff, but my village continues to be a huge group of people that support me and my endeavors, and also just even with independent living skills and things that I struggle with. So family, even employers, and even getting to work with people like the folks that are putting this on today. So my village continues to keep growing. So it's pretty exciting. And when we think about this village and following instructions, I want it to be clear that there is no magic recipe to raising an autistic child. Every single one of us is completely different with different strengths and weaknesses and needs. So what worked for my family might not work for yours. What worked for you might not work for me. I know people that try different interventions and have different hobbies and things like that. Like, for instance, I might not be doing a dietary intervention, for instance, because it just didn't work for me. I really like to eat gluten, but not everyone, but some people will say that not eating that worked wonders for them. I also was someone who did really well with riding horses and all sorts of different things, but there was no magic formula to have success or to overcome certain obstacles. Just like at the same time, even for us, when we do get out into the world or beyond, there's no special manual for being an autistic person. So I'm not trying to become neurotypical. A lot of the time, people will say that I overcame autism, and I kind of laugh because it's not really true. What I'm overcoming is things that are hard for me, just like anybody else. And I also have to overcome the stereotypes and stigmas that are in the way of that are associated with autism more so than autism itself. So this is kind of basic disability study stuff, is this idea of the social model of disability, which says very concisely that society's attitudes and the environment around us could be more disabling than any label or diagnosis can be. which is something that I kind of notice, is that people want us to be neurotypical, but at the same time, I am just trying to be the best version of myself I can be, just like anybody else. So you can have a really great team, and you can also keep trying different things to find what we're passionate about, what we enjoy, all these different things. So it's really important to kind of keep that in mind. I also like to mention how development is not linear. And when I say that development isn't linear, so everything kind of follows an order, right? Like you crawl, then you walk, and then you run, and maybe sometimes there's certain milestones that children are hitting, for instance, and it follows this very ABC thing. So that isn't always necessarily the case with autism or other developmental disabilities too. So sometimes you'll see the ABCs out of order, and that doesn't mean that it's wrong. Like this really great tweet that I found was, it's kind of more like a remix. So sometimes I would be, not talking, but I'd be doing the 100-piece jigsaw puzzle, or even now, I can hypothetically like pass the bar exam, which I did, and I still have no idea how to use a hair straightener properly. I didn't know how to tie my shoes until I was maybe 10 or 12 years old. I have no idea how to braid my hair. I have no idea how to do some of these very milestone type things that a lot of young women or other girls or other children were able to do. So that's not a bad thing that maybe my alphabet wasn't A, B, C, but maybe it was A, B, Q, D in going in some other order. And that's okay. It's okay if I never see those extra letters somewhere, because this is my remix and this is how I am doing my best. I want to talk a little bit about speaking and writing and who I am as well. So I have always been someone who loves to talk once I began talking in kindergarten. So I also transitioned out of echolalia. So if you don't know what that word means, I know most of us who aren't in the field of disability don't. It's basically this idea of repeating things over and over that we hear from somebody else. So if you have ever quoted your favorite movie or TV show many, many times, you've probably engaged in this idea of echolalia before. But for people who have autism or other developmental disabilities or intellectual disabilities, it could be the only way we're communicating. So I like to think of one of my favorite movies, and there's a line, and he's like, "That's a bingo," and people would say things like, "That's a bingo," just to literally mean that, because it was the easiest way to communicate. But I moved past that kind of around the first grade, when I'd be saying whatever I was feeling and thinking. I also was a kid who was in drama, so this picture is from my third grade play. I had a singing solo. Thankfully, I am not here to sing because I'm really not a good singer, but I did drama for most of my elementary school years. It made me feel comfortable speaking. It was a lot more fun. I did a wedding toast when I was a kid, and I always just love to talk about the things that I'm interested in. So I really do feel like I have the greatest job and pleasure of my life getting to talk about autism and disability all day, because the things that I enjoy talking about, I could talk about for hours, and especially to a big group. It's far easier for me to talk to a group than it is for me to do, say, the lunch table of like 8 people and try to follow all the different conversations. So for me, public speaking has always been far easier than interacting with a small group or even one-on-one sometimes, because, as much as we love Zoom, kind of the weird thing is too, is I don't see all of your faces. So I'm not kind of trying to be like, oh my God, I have to gauge all these different expressions. I have to see what this person is saying at the same time. Like, it's kind of a different communication style that works really well for me. And while most people are afraid, I'm not. And I embrace that as one of the things that is a strength for me. I also love to write, which is kind of the opposite of speaking sometimes, but I see writing as a third language. Okay. So I'm fluent in English, and I'm fluent in like running my mouth and talking, but I see writing as my third language. And for me, it's always been a way to give back. So I wrote my first book starting when I was 13. I was at an autism conference in Orlando, Florida, and I was on a panel where I was the youngest one and the only girl. And needless to say, at Q&A time, which we will have later today too, I was the one who got all the questions because I was young and I was the only girl. And someone asked me about how I found out that I was autistic. And I told them a story about when I was 9 years old and how my parents compared it a lot to being like Harry Potter. And what my mom said to me that day was that different isn't bad. It's just different. And different could be extraordinary. And needless to say, I believed I had magic powers and magic in me, just like Harry Potter, throughout my entire adolescence and even in adulthood, I didn't feel insecure about being different at all. And I also went to 3 schools in 3 years at that point, and I wanted to give back to others. So I began writing, thinking if I could just share something I went through or some part of my story, hoping that I can help one person, this was all worth it. And I truly 100% believe it's worth it if I'm able to do that. And that's why I keep writing, is knowing that our words can help make a difference. And I also like to write now because it's a way to give information in an accessible format that you can kind of digest on your own time. So sometimes with speaking or attending a webinar like this, you're thinking, oh my God, I want to stop there. I missed something. I want to write it down. And that's why I also like to write, is that things kind of move a little bit at a slower pace. And I also am able to talk about some different niche topics as well. So for World Autism Awareness Day, I actually wrote a piece for CBS about how Star Trek is a staple in autistic culture that came out today. I'll link it to you guys later, but I'm really excited about it. It's a little bit nerdy, but it's really cool because I got to talk about how other people related to things like Spock, and it made other fans of the show who might not have that experience with people like me feel a connection to something they care about, and also to autism as well. So it's really cool getting to bridge that gap and kind of be a translator of sorts between the autistic mind and the neurotypical mind too. So to close out a little bit more about me and my journey, I like to tell people that I am a work in progress and getting to where I am a little bit at a time. So I'm not sure 100% where my journey is going to take me. And I also want to say this because I'm not done yet. And I didn't, like I said earlier, I didn't necessarily overcome autism, and it's never going to happen. I'm just going to keep overcoming the stereotypes and stigmas in the way. And I was thinking about this a lot today as well, because again, it's World Autism Awareness Day. And Facebook gave me a reminder of the Facebook post that I put up for World Autism Awareness Day 5 years ago. And in terms of what I wrote 5 years ago, I felt really afraid and kind of discouraged in a way because nothing has changed. So I was still saying the same things I was saying 5 years ago about inclusion and acceptance and let's do better and let's listen to one another. So I was really excited to know that I still have hope in this and that that's still a work in progress. And I've changed as well as how I'm going about that too. So we are all continuing to grow and get to where we're meant to go. So it's not this just overcoming one aspect of life. And since then as well, because I wrote that when I was a college senior and was thinking about this, and I ended up posting it again today. Since then, I am an attorney, which still blows my mind. I did a CLE the other day, and I felt so cool getting to enter my Florida bar number. Like, whoa, that's actually me. So I went to college at the University of Florida. Go Gators for any Gators in the house. I went to law school at the University of Miami. If you guys are wondering who I root for in football, it depends on who was playing who. If you really want to go deeper into my football alliances, usually it's pretty easy if anybody's playing at FSU. So no offense to the Seminoles around here. I passed the Florida bar in July of 2018. Passing was the greatest relief of my life. For any of you who have ever taken the bar, you know it's kind of a nightmare to think about. And one of the proudest moments of my life was getting sworn in, and this picture's from my swearing-in ceremony, because the judge who swore me in at the Miami-Dade courthouse talked a lot about the faculty of speech, and that lawyers often take speaking for granted, that of course we're advocates for others, right? Of course we know what we're doing. Of course we know how to run our mouths and make clients have faith in us, and also to persuade others what we're thinking and feeling and what the arguments are. But she explained that after swearing me in and having me in her courtroom, she never took that for granted. She took it for granted. And that's something I would never do. And we explained that as someone who didn't have the means to speak, because their only communication was basically screaming and crying and pointing at things, because how else do you communicate when you physically can't get the words out for whatever the reason, or your brain's not making that connection. So we talked a lot about how it was important for me to use my voice for others, and also to keep perspective of that and to never take that voice for granted. Needless to say, anyone who went to my swearing ceremony cried. I was too busy hoping that I would make it through the words without fumbling, and then I cried after I got home. So, and then that's when things got really interesting, is people would be like, you're Florida's first openly autistic attorney. And every day someone asks me, what does that even mean? What does it mean to be openly autistic? And I go, that is an excellent question. And it's a question we will unpack again with a more of a written quote, because I know I wrote this out before as well, and it sounds a little bit better later in the presentation today. But for me, it's a celebration in the freedom to be who I am, because when you disclose that you're autistic, people do treat you differently if they didn't know before, or they have those stereotypes and preconceived notions of who you are or what you must be capable of. So I remember the first time I told someone in law school, we were having a conversation. It was probably right before fall break, my first year. And it ended up coming out of my mouth, and somebody told me, they just looked at me and they told me, oh, and they just suddenly started talking to me like I was a little kid. I've also seen when I asked for an advisor on a paper before, halfway through my career, they asked me why I chose the topic I did, and I explained that I was a student with a disability and it meant a lot to me. And this professor just said, well, congratulations on getting into law school. And I'm like, I'm halfway to graduation at this point. So you do open yourself up to different forms of discrimination and ableism, which is attitudes towards people with disabilities. We could probably have a whole other long lecture on ableism one day. And people also ask me what being a lawyer is like sometimes. And for me, practicing law was a privilege. I never take for granted that I'm able to do this. I know most people complain when they have to do their continuing education. And as much as sometimes I want to complain because it takes a long time, I never do, because I remember how privileged I am and how lucky I am to even get to have a law license to be renewed, because it is such a rare thing, especially for people with disabilities. And people on the autism spectrum are told and expected so little of us, that we have such low expectations. So I practiced for a little over a year in my last job. I left at the beginning of the new year, and I started my own business doing speaking and consulting and working with companies and firms and stuff on neurodiversity at work, and also working on writing my next book, which I'm really, really excited about, and probably what I will do later tonight, because I'm like, I have so much I want to talk about and so much I want to get done. So with not practicing and doing all that stuff, things are really, really exciting, and I get to geek out about disability and autism all the time, and it really is amazing getting to do something that I'm passionate about. And I am so grateful that I did go to law school and I'm able to do this stuff. So moving on, a little bit about what I am trying to do as well, and this also segues into our next discussion on the workplace, is about shaping the neurodiversity conversation. So when I say neurodiversity, I'm not just talking about autism, though the neurodiversity movement did really start with autism. So neurodiversity is the idea that neurological differences are to be recognized and respected just like any other human variation, such as gender or sexual orientation or or race. And labels that fall under neurodiversity do include autism, ADHD, learning disabilities like dyslexia, Tourette syndrome, and intellectual disabilities. I know for me, because I love the neurodiversity community, I mostly see a lot of other autistic people and people with ADHD. It is very cool getting to share this with them and have a form of solidarity. So neurodiversity at work is something that I like to talk about, especially because it comes into this idea of autism and unemployment and employment. So here's some of the benefits that we've seen. So we've seen neurodiverse teams at SAP, which is one of those giant technology companies, that they were able to save the company millions of dollars with a technical fix. That companies that employ people who are neurodiverse, such as Publix in our communities is who I think of right away, that they have higher revenues than companies that do not employ people with disabilities. People think of these businesses favorably. We feel good about ourselves, right? Like we feel good about ourselves when we see people with disabilities in public and not just, living in somebody's basement. And all of us benefit from working with people who are different than us and have different life experiences. But the numbers tell a different story, even with all these benefits. So here's kind of a little bit of a lowdown. I like numbers generally, so that's why I found this really fun to put together into research. So 1 in 4 Americans is someone who has a disability. And if you want to know how much 1 in 4 is, that's about 61 million people. And it's also the only minority that you can join at any point in your life. So whether you one day age and you get God forbid, get in an accident, or you just have those different experiences as well, or like a stroke, anything like that, that disability is the one minority anybody can join at any point in their lives. So out of all disabilities though, autistic people like me have the lowest employment rate of all. 80% of us who are college graduates are unemployed. And according to the ARC, with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities overall, only 36% of us are paid employees at places. So a lot of us are unpaid laborers or unemployed overall. And as a lawyer, because I was talking about the privilege of getting to practice and being part of this profession, lawyers with disabilities generally make up less than 1% of lawyers. If you want to be exact, it's 0.55%. If you looked at the 2018 data, it was maybe about 0.52%. And they're saying, look, there were gains for lawyers with disabilities. And as you can see, that really isn't that big of a gain. And for disabled women, generally, that the unemployment rate is higher than for disabled men. And when you put it next to non-disabled women, it's pretty staggering as well. So every October, the Department of Labor and the government put together National Disability Employment Awareness Month. That is October. So we can have this conversation again in October with a theme. And last year's theme was the right talent right now. I like to bring this up because here's the thing. People with disabilities and autistic people, we're ready to work. We want to work. We're ready, willing, and able. That vocational rehab departments work with us, that job coaches work with us. We went to school for certain trades and we have so many passions and we're ready. It's just that the companies and businesses aren't necessarily always ready to work with us. So that's a conversation that needs to change, and that this talent is out there and is definitely ready and wants to be part of the workforce. And with that in mind, I also like to remind people why we have this disparity. Why are so many autistic people unemployed generally, especially with all the benefits? Is first off, traditional hiring practices have bias against us. So the way that I communicate and interact with the world is not the same way that everybody else does. It's kind of like being bilingual in a way. And I like to talk about language a lot because the best way to describe navigating the world as an autistic person is imagine that English isn't your first language and you grew up speaking something else, but you eventually get really good at English, right? And no matter how good your English is at that point, you will always have this accent that shows this is not your first language or where you're from, or some kind of cultural difference will show. And then people are thinking that was insensitive or that was wrong. So one of the biggest things in our communication styles that differs, on top of just being pretty blunt, is things like eye contact. So people in HR have told me, and research has shown this as well, that HR professionals and interviewers look at eye contact as a measure of whether or not somebody is able to be trusted. While for an autistic person, making eye contact might just mean I don't feel comfortable doing this, or it might be physically painful for them. Personally, I am not big on eye contact. I find it kind of awkward and uncomfortable to feel like I'm like staring into somebody's soul. So pro tip for anyone who is avoidant of eye contact, or if there are any autistic people in the house who need kind of a fix to make the neurotypical people feel good about this, and so you don't feel like you're getting judged, look at people in the nose. They don't know the difference. It looks just like looking them in the eyes, but you don't have to have that uncomfortable feeling. Thank you, you're welcome. So we also see things like gaps in employment. We see discrimination at different parts of the process, and the decision of when to disclose, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well, kind of comes into play. And sometimes people treat you differently when you do disclose. And most of all, what I've noticed from anytime I've ever talked to business leaders is there's a fear of the unknown. So it's not that people don't want to hire people with disabilities or autistic people. They just don't know what to expect. They're not sure about an experience they don't have, just like I don't know about experiences I don't have either. And it's natural to be afraid of something you just don't know. And a lot of people will ask me things like, what about accommodations? What about this? What about that? And it's really important to understand that that fear is valid, and it's our job to help educate people, which is why we're having this discussion today too. So hopefully you feel a little bit less afraid, and to know that there are people that want to work with you so we don't have that same fear or lack of understanding as well. So disclosure is kind of the really big thing that comes up a lot when it comes to neurodiversity and autism at work, is when that right time is. And honestly, there is no correct answer. It really depends on the person. If you Google me, you will know I'm autistic. So my answer is pretty straightforward. It's usually right away. It comes up on a resume or in a cover letter, because if I take out the fact that, yeah, I've been on this TV show, I've written for this place about autism, I've written a book, I've done this, I've done that, my resume looks kind of empty. It looks kind of strange. And I can't come up with a really good reason to say, yeah, I care about this, because, like, I don't know, my brother or sister or my siblings. And I'm like, I don't have siblings. I don't have this connection that I can't like invent something. And I'm just not a good liar to begin with. So better not. And also for me, disclosing pretty early on helps weed out people that aren't going to be friendly or won't be accepting in the first place. But the answer also changes as well. And again, I mentioned earlier in the presentation, I'm openly autistic. And for me, it's not having to hide that. And it's being exactly who I am. So take it or leave it. But for the real answer of when to disclose and what rights you have, because again, still a lawyer and still excited about the Americans with Disabilities Act because it is the 30th anniversary this year in July. And again, because we were talking about policy, it was bipartisan legislation. It is something that affects everybody, disability rights or civil rights. And Title I of the Act prohibits discrimination in employment. And so during the hiring process, firing, advancement, pay, training, and any business with 15 or more employees. And here's kind of the bare bones in English, not the legalese of the statute of it. So you can't discriminate against people with disabilities. You do not have to disclose legally under the ADA unless you actually need an accommodation. And employers have to provide reasonable accommodations unless it's unduly a hardship. And the most that you're allowed to be asked about a disability is in the terms of the essential functions of the job, which means if it's something that's really important to that job, like in the job description, they can ask, can you do this thing in the essential functions with or without an accommodation? So for me, the essential functions, for instance, of being a lawyer would be being able to research and write and argue something. Like that's the easiest way to describe it, not the, can you pick up a 50-pound box of documents, which sometimes you might see in a description, but again, it's not as essential as say the things that go on in my brain and whether or not that I am qualified in terms of education. That if I hypothetically couldn't pick up this 50-pound box, somebody else can help me with it. I talked to a law librarian about this as well, and he said, they hired me for my brain, not my ability to lift a 50-pound box. And that's kind of the best way to describe this idea of essential function and what should be accommodated or isn't as important as well. So when we talk about undue hardship, this is where kind of everybody gets a little bit scared when it comes to accommodating or working with the unknown. So it really isn't that hard to accommodate people. Most accommodations for disability cost $500 or less, and most of them are usually free. So people ask me all the time, what does an accommodation look like for an autistic person like me? So for me, some of the biggest things that I got and that I was able to ask for in my last job is I wore headphones in the office. As long as I was able to hear the phone ring, it was okay. That was the rule. So I have these really great noise canceling headphones that are sitting in my bedroom right now. And I got them for the holidays. And honestly, they were like the greatest thing ever. I have no idea how I made it so long without noise canceling headphones, but they were not appropriate to take to work because you literally can't hear anything else with them. But I would take earbuds, for instance, and as long as I was able to hear the phone when somebody needed me or another attorney had a question, it was okay. And for me, that was really powerful because I wouldn't hear the hum of the lights. I wouldn't hear the chatter around where the paralegals were, all sorts of different things like that. And it made me more productive and able to do my job better. And as much as the hum of the lights would bother me, it would be an undue hardship probably if I asked my old office to replace all the fluorescent lights. As much as I would have loved that, because not only do they hum, but they're really, really bright and they're kind of annoying and some people get headaches from them. So if you are designing a space, I highly recommend maybe not doing fluorescent lights because a lot of people would probably agree with me and I still wonder who invented them in the first place. So this is what they look like and people go, how do I even get this? Great question. So ask your employer because if you don't ask, you can't receive anything, and try to put it in writing if you can. It's also an ongoing collaboration. So we would talk regularly, like what's working, what's not working, and try to come up with the best strategies possible to make sure that something would work for us and that I was able to do my job as effectively as possible. Some people, especially in today's times with coronavirus, are also self-employed. So this includes our gig workers and freelancers and contractors. So when I think of people, I think of anyone who's delivering groceries, Uber drivers, freelance writers, anyone who kind of falls into this self-employed or small business owner. Because now that I'm a small business owner, I think about this a lot differently too, is there's no HR department that I'm going to go to if like something is bothering me, right? Like I report to myself. And accommodating yourself is a whole other form of accountability as well. And sometimes for me, executive functioning is difficult. So it's a little bit hard to remember what the most important thing on my calendar is, what the deadlines are, things like that sometimes. So if I miss a deadline, for instance, I have to be accountable not only to myself, but whoever I'm working with as well. Is, oh my God, how do I make sure that this gets done? So it might be for me setting an extra reminder rather than some higher up going, did you get it done? So there's a whole other subset of how to accommodate yourself when you are self-employed, because again, you're not under the ADA because you're less than 15 people most likely, and all these other things as well. So it's just kind of a tidbit and something that's been on my mind recently as a small business owner, but your mileage may vary. Moving past that stuff, there's also this huge employment disparity that we talked about earlier, and how are we going to get to the bottom of this? And here's kind of my 3 main points that I think to help make it so that we have more autistic people who are employed in our community is that we have autism at work recruitment and hiring programs. We need to solve the intellectual and developmental disability employment paradigm. And we also need to break stereotypes about autism and other related disabilities. So autism at work is a huge initiative that's going on with a lot of large companies that are purposely recruiting people on the spectrum to work for them. So you see places like SAP, Microsoft, JP Morgan, Ernst & Young, TD Bank now has joined in on the Autism at Work initiatives. And it's really wonderful to see this. But I do have my own issues with it because a lot of these companies, as you're noticing, work in very specialized tech fields, which kind of goes into some of the stereotypes that we'll be addressing later too. So you see this happening, you see people getting employed through it, and that's wonderful. And it's a great start to combating and bringing awareness to this issue that affects our community. We also have to ask ourselves, is there place for people in all kinds of roles, because the world needs all kinds of minds? So this is something I consider the public's problem, or the genius in the grocery store. So what kind of happens is I realize that there's 2 very distinct subsets of jobs that usually recruit autistic people or people with disabilities. It's either retail or tech, that you see those 2 very distinct things and nothing really in the middle. So while it might be wonderful every time that I see the baggers at Publix who have a disability, or the grocery store, and they make me feel incredible, because I'm really glad that we do have community partners like that that are hiring many of my friends, many of my colleagues, I also wonder, would someone like that be making the same effort to hire me, for instance, if I was looking for a general counsel job? Would they be hiring people with disabilities or autistic people in the marketing departments, in HR, in legal? And I'm not sure what the answer is. Anytime I've ever asked about this, the answers that I've gotten have been a little bit beating around the bush, so to speak. And there's also this idea of sheltered workshops or just places that solely employ people with disabilities. So when you see those cafes on the news, or places like Goodwill, for instance, like certain places that just employ certain groups of people. These are valuable and have a place in our community too, but it shouldn't be the only way that people on the autism spectrum are employed either, that we should be in integrated environments too. And finally, there's the whole issue, which can again be a whole other separate legal presentation, about sub-minimum wage, so that under a Great Depression piece of legislation, corporations, for instance, can get certificates from the federal government to pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage. It is something that has been getting phased out. I believe there's a bill about it currently in Congress. I'm not 100% sure, but it's something that comes up on a bipartisan basis pretty regularly. And it's something that I believe a lot of the major presidential candidates right now have been working to address as well. And then we get to our stereotypes. So I've noticed there's 2 big stereotypes for autism and hiring, especially. One of them is that we're all STEM geniuses, right? That we're all going to be like computer geniuses, the next Bill Gates. I noticed this even in my last job, as I would get on these really big, cumbersome data and documentation projects. So I worked in healthcare and anti-terrorism litigation, which would require sometimes going through millions of documents and millions of different pieces of data. And considering I was autistic and probably the person who was good at computers, that was kind of the assumption, is that I was the person to talk to go through all the data and to be able to sort through it. I was able to do it, but that doesn't mean I was the best person for it. I didn't major in computer science. I majored in psychology and criminology. I was definitely not someone who was an engineer someday. And while I was able to do it, that wasn't what I was expecting to do with my entire career either. I wanted to go to court more. I wanted to do all of these other skills that didn't require just certain data things too. So those stereotypes have been in play in my career too, because people assume those are the things that I must be really, really good at. And further, people assume that all people with disabilities and autism are going to work in the fields of autism advocacy or disability. So every single day, without fail, for the past year and a half already, I will get a call, email, Facebook message, something from a parent or a community member asking about their child's IEP plan or something in terms of discrimination that they faced and ask me to take on their legal case. I am not a special education attorney. I am not the best person to do that. While I might have that personal experience, it doesn't mean that's what I know how to do. I do work in the field of disability now because, again, I get to talk about disability all the time, but that doesn't mean I'm the best legal advocate for that specific problem. So at this point, I've been really good at building up a network of people that I know who are really good at it and saying, this is who you should talk to. So that kind of shows that stereotype as well, like just not like every person who might be marginalized in some way works in that field of rights. For instance, like not every woman works in women's rights and different feminist causes, for instance, or not every LGBTQ person is working on LGBTQ rights projects. The same is true for disability and autism especially. So I think a lot about these three things that we talked about and what the future looks like. I see a neurodiverse leadership so that one day people like me will be making hiring decisions, creating neurodiversity at work programs, so not just autism at work, because this is much bigger than just us. And I think that we'll also have further collaboration between the business communities and the disability communities and the autistic community. And again, to align people to their strengths all across the spectrum, whatever that might mean to you. So making sure that people can do things that interest them and that they are really good at as well. So it's not just putting people into boxes. It's making sure that all kinds of roles and all kinds of places have room for us, and that if you match us to the things that we enjoy, we're going to excel. And again, when I say focus on the strengths, here's a really handy graphic that I found courtesy of the University of Leeds and Autism Speaks that kind of talked about some of the things that autistic people are really, really good at, and that I think employers should be thinking of when they're aligning to strengths. So things like attention to detail, a deep focus, that we're very observant, that we retain a lot of facts, that we are really good at the things that we know a lot about, and that we can be analytical and creative and resilient, and that we're accepting of others because we know what it's like not to be accepted. And we are also very honest. So things like this are things to think about when you are hiring people who might be autistic or different than you as well, is to focus on these strengths. So some of my final reflections on this idea as well is how can we do better, not just in retail, not just in STEM, and not just in the law, across every profession, to make sure that people like me are not only being hired, but that we're accepted and supported at work as well. So it's not just, we did the thing, we brought this person in. Let's make sure they stay. Let's make sure they grow. And how can we make sure that people succeeding is normal and not an exception? So I think part of the reason my story got the traction that it did over the last year or so is that people weren't used to seeing autistic people becoming lawyers, that people weren't used to seeing people like me succeed. And I want to see a world where that's not an exception. I would love to see autistic attorneys in every state. Whenever I meet another attorney on the spectrum, like, you are awesome. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for being in this with me. And sometimes it's attorneys that have been in practice longer than I've been alive. And sometimes it's someone who's a 3L just about to take the bar exam. So making sure that we're succeeding and we're across all professions in all disciplines and doing the thing and showing up as our full selves every day shows that we exist and it's not just an exception. I always say the best thing people said to me is, so what, when I tell them my story, like, so what that you're autistic? Like, and as much as that seems like it should be hurtful, it's not, because it shows that it's not a big deal that I'm different. It shows that I'm just a person like anybody else, that it shouldn't be a big deal. And I want you to think about that just imagine how our world would be if we were all that much more accepting and worked with people who were different than us. So on that note, a very happy World Autism Awareness Day to you. And I look forward to moving forward from this awareness idea into greater acceptance.
Haley, thank you so much. That was absolutely exceptional. Hearing that as a parent, as an advocate, just someone who has had this journey, I agree with you. It will be a beautiful day when we can just say, so what? So thank you. I'd like to now introduce Martha Lenderman. We had some technical challenges. She was supposed to be at the top of the hour, but we're so happy that she joined us because Martha is an expert in her field. She has had over 30 years of service with the state and has served one time as our state's Bakers Act director. She's also been instrumental in the Baker Act and the Marchman Act, which she will explain the difference. She's helped to rewrite the Baker Act and included in supporting with the support of creating forms and handbooks, survey instruments, and most importantly, bench guides for judges. Her resume is very long, and I'm trying to distill it to have the program move forward. But I want to honor her by saying we appreciate her service on the Florida Supreme Court's Commission on Fairness and her many years of service of working with courts, hospitals, law enforcement agencies, professional associations, and just the general Florida community. So with that, Martha, thank you. And we look forward to hearing more and learning about the Baker Act and the challenges that you see as it intersects with the autistic population. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Kimberly. But before I get started, I have to say how impressed I was and in awe by Haley's wonderful presentation. I continue to learn from her. And I am very glad that the equipment malfunction, technical malfunction got resolved. But I'm really honored to be here today, to be included in this program. I'm not an expert in autism like Haley is, like the parents and family members that may be on the program, certainly the educators and other professionals. So thank you so much for wanting to learn more each and every day. My expertise, as Kim said, is in the Baker Act. And many of you have experienced or maybe heard about, seen incidents that have occurred with people with autism who have had to undergo an examination under the Baker Act. Now, most of the media accounts, and those represent probably a very tiny percentage of all people that undergo an exam, describe them as very inappropriate, even a misuse of the law, and perhaps even an abuse. There's a couple of Baker Act related links on this program. One is a PowerPoint presentation that'll give you far more information than I'll be able to incorporate in this presentation. Each one of those slides does have citations from the law and the Florida Administrative Code, so you can look at those to actually access more information. There's also other information in it having to do with the prevalence of use here in Pinellas County, and you'll see how high a suicide rate we also have in Pinellas compared with most places in the state. And the last several slides incorporate a lot of access to free training and resources that you could obtain of a factual basis rather than so much that may be out there. But hopefully between this program today, as well as with the resources I've given you, we can eliminate a lot of misinformation and focus on fact-based. And we want to make sure the Baker Act is used appropriately at all times. And let me just tell you a little history on it. It was actually written by the Florida legislature back in 1971. It was named after Maxine Baker, who was the legislative chair of the committee that produced this bill. And each state has its own mental health law, and each one is quite different from another. And our law does get modified every couple of years in a minor sort of way. But a lot of folks don't know what the alternatives to the Baker Act may be. I never start a presentation to any group, whether it's law enforcement, mental health professionals, and courts, without first talking about alternatives. And you would see that at least listed on slide 2, one of which is that it cannot be used as a substitute for services for autistic people. And hopefully that will come out in my comments. Let me just cover a little bit for you the voluntary and involuntary examinations that are provided for in the Baker Act, as well as longer-term treatment beyond the initial examination. While there's many clinical definitions for mental illness, it's only one legal definition, and that is in the Baker Act, and I'll paraphrase it a little for you. It describes it not by a name of a diagnosis, but by a descriptive phrase. It's an impairment of the mental or emotional processes that exercise conscious control of one's actions or the ability to perceive or understand reality. So these are the very serious mental illnesses, not the ones that all of us maybe share on an occasion or another that may or may not interfere with our lives. It also has a functional component to it, which it has to substantially interfere with the person's ability to meet the ordinary demands of living. So the term excludes certain conditions. Those conditions include any developmental disability, as defined in the Chapter 393 of this Florida law. It excludes substance abuse impairment, and it includes antisocial behavior. The Florida legislature just added 2 more exclusions to that list, and that would be for dementia and traumatic brain injury to take effect as of July 1st, assuming the governor doesn't veto it, which I doubt he will. But mental illness doesn't discriminate. It can affect people of all demographics and of all kinds of conditions they may already have medically or perhaps even developmentally. Just as people who have substance abuse disorders often have a co-occurring mental illness, it could be an appropriate initiation of a Baker Act if the mental illness is determined to be sufficient enough on its own to warrant an examination, and the other conditions are also met. So we have many people who have autism that may also have a co-occurring mental illness. So it might be acute anxiety, depression, other mood disorders, and so forth. And it's possible that it could be a very appropriate thing under certain circumstances. So on voluntary admission, just to be very brief, it requires that the person be not only willing to be at a facility, but able to give express and informed consent, both to the admission and to the treatment that they might undergo, if necessary. And that express and informed consent is a very high level. It says that have to be able to make well-reasoned, willful, and knowing decisions about their mental illness, their mental health care, their medical care, and even substance abuse in order to be eligible to be voluntary. And since all minors are considered incompetent under state law because of their age, parental consent is required for a minor's voluntary admission, not the involuntary, but for a voluntary admission, as well as for any treatment that the child, short of an emergency treatment, that the child might need while at a facility. Involuntary, and that's what we usually hear people refer to when they talk about being Baker Acted. The exam requires simply that there be a reason to believe that certain criteria is met. Now, reason to believe is not proof. It doesn't require that there be a prior diagnosis of some type of mental illness. It simply is a reason to believe that the person has a mental illness, as is defined in the law, and that the person has either refused the examination or isn't able to make that decision on their own. And that it requires danger, some type of risk of either a passive or active basis. Passive danger is that of severe self-neglect as a result of their illness that can't be avoided through the help of willing family, friends, and other kinds of services. The active danger, though, is that of serious bodily harm, and that's what we usually hear about, and in particular to do with children. Rarely do we see an involuntary exam initiated on a child due to self-neglect, but rather because of some acting out behavior. But it's a little more than that. It talks about there's a substantial likelihood that without care or treatment, the person will cause serious bodily harm. to themselves or someone else, is evidenced by recent behavior. It doesn't define what is recent. It doesn't define what is near future. That's going to be in the eye of the initiator. The requirement that less restrictive alternatives only applies when it's related to self-neglect. It is not mentioned specifically for the act of harm when that's the basis of it. So it can be initiated and involuntary any one of three ways. The criteria is the same regardless of which way is used. It can be based on a court that has the option of initiating it based upon sworn testimony. It could be by a mental health professional, and there's a number of those that have been determined to be authorized to initiate. If they have personally examined the individual no more than 48 hours prior to the initiation, and that they have reached the conclusion the person meets the criteria based upon their own observations. And the third way is through a law enforcement officer. And in this case, the officer, if they have reason to believe the person appears to meet that criteria, will rely upon and describe in their report the circumstances under which the initiation was done. This can be credible hearsay. It might be based upon what a parent saw or a teacher saw or other person on a campus, a neighbor, whatever. It's up to the law enforcement officer. Transportation is often a critical issue, but the law says that law enforcement is responsible for that transportation, but each county has to do a transportation plan, and the county at cost could actually delegate some or all of that to emergency medical services or private contract agencies. Once a person's at a Baker Act facility, they have to be examined by a physician, a psychologist, and in some cases by a psychiatric nurse. And it has to be done without unnecessary delay. However, it has to be completed within no more than 72 hours, in addition to any time in which a medical emergency might have been diagnosed. In that case, that would be added to the 72 hours. But just because a person is released quickly, perhaps within hours after being brought to a facility, does not mean that the initial initiation of that Baker Act was inappropriate. I think, and I'll deal with that in just a moment, but within that 72 hours, the person has to be released from the facility to be, they can convert to voluntary status, or a petition can be filed with the circuit court in order that there be a hearing established, and of course a public defender is appointed immediately to represent the wishes of the person. And if clear and convincing evidence, including no less restrictive alternatives at that point, have been proven, the order for treatment for up to 90 days can be entered by the court. People have a right to a number of constitutional and guaranteed rights under the Baker Act, and all too often we do end up hearing about how certain facilities may not appropriately honor those rights of people. Dignity is one of those specifically mentioned, to be respected at all times, including when the person is transported. And in this case, we do have a provision in the law that says restraining devices, handcuffs, can't be used for people with mental illness except for the protection of the person or others. So if the officer documents that, then they are allowed to do that, but certainly would not be their first choice. Notification's a huge one for family members. Florida's education law, as well as the Baker Act, require that parents and guardians be notified immediately after an involuntary examination is initiated. And the Baker Act requires that they be notified as soon as the person arrives at the facility. There's very limited exceptions to that notification. Communication. I hear complaints regularly that family members say they can't contact or communicate openly with their loved one. That's is absolutely stated in the law, that each facility has to permit immediate access to patient by family members, guardian, or their attorney. Unless the doctor has documented well, the access would be detrimental. Guardians have right to see the clinical record. Confidentiality is not, doesn't apply when it's a guardian. Habeas corpus is important too, because a patient or the guardian can file a petition anytime with the court in order to challenge the legality of being held there, or that they're being unjustly denied right, or that some procedure is being abused. And due process is always applicable, and in this case, no longer than 72 hours can they be held unless there's an emergency medical, unless they're transferred to voluntary or a petition is filed with the court and an attorney appointed. So there's all kinds of complaint resolution features as well. Certainly one would hope in the quickest way might be to register the complaint with the facility in the hope that it'll be resolved. But otherwise, the Agency for Healthcare Administration takes these and investigates against hospitals or crisis units. DCF investigates because they do the designation of receiving facilities, both hospitals and crisis units. The the Department of Health on medical quality assurance is they license the mental health professionals, doctors, disability rights, the Agency for Persons with Disabilities. All of these are appropriate places to file complaints. So one could say, well, given all of these rights and all of these procedures, what's the problem? Well, we can count a number of ways, I think. The Developmental Disabilities Law, for one instance, does not have any corresponding emergency measure to deal with what might constitute kind of risky behavior on the part of a person towards self and others. It only has the provisions in it for the involuntary admission to residential services. It has a whole series of multi-level exams, approvals, notices, hearings, orders, and so forth. I'm not going to go into that detail on it today, but it does constitute a barrier and forces people sometimes into accessing it through the Baker Act, which would not be appropriate necessarily. People that work with the Baker Act know that the Baker Act and its provisions saves lives every single day. We know that the rate of suicide has continued to increase rapidly, and especially with children and adolescents. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among youth aged 10 to 14. And in fact, a huge research project showed that 8% of 9 and 10-year-olds in the United States report having suicidal thoughts, and 2 out of every 100 of those 9 and 10-year-olds report an actual suicide attempt. Children and adolescents do, in general, display very poor impulse control. In fact, very potentially harmful behavior. They're not done yet in terms of their brain. Even as any parent can tell, their adolescent child is really hormonal and can cause some very unexpected behavior. But in a short time, most of these kids can regain control and might be talking about Billy's party next Saturday. And but by then, the Baker Act has been initiated, and law enforcement, for example, can get called to a home by family members because of an out-of-control situation and an outburst, and law enforcement won't walk away from one of those situations generally without some type of intervention. And yet their alternatives are their options are very, very few. And everything starts looking like a Baker Act because that's what they know. So if there's a real belief the child is actively at risk due to a mental illness, and the Baker Act might be appropriate in those situations. Once it's initiated, the exam has to take place at either a hospital or Baker Act receiving facility. But if that behavior is highly predictable and the IEP identifies the interventions that have quickly and successfully resolved the issue, de-escalated the child's behavior in the past, then that should always be done in advance of initiating a Baker Act whenever possible. So even though lives are saved every day through the use of the Baker Act, you all know that are participating in this program that the process I've described to you can be devastating to a child with autism and can have very short-term and long-term consequences. Stigma from other students, from family, and even school personnel. Sometimes they have to have a change of schools by the parents to reduce that stigma. There could be social isolation and targeted bullying from their peers. There can be a lack of connectivity of that child and the family to aftercare treatment, a loss of education if they're suspended, financial costs to family members for that psychiatric admission. And yes, there can be potential limitations of future academic and vocational opportunities for the child, and we could go on and on. There are some improvements that could take place, I think, without necessarily causing a huge amount of cost or problems. New legislation in the Development and Disabilities Law to more appropriately deal with emergency interventions for people with autism. Giving law enforcement the option instead of the duty to initiate an involuntary under the Baker Act when they think the criteria is met. Use of telehealth may be a great opportunity so that receiving facility personnel can actually perform the examination by telephone and electronic means without the necessity of actually transporting the person to a Baker Act receiving facility. There could be increased training required and maybe elevating expectations of people who deal with individuals with autism to use de-escalation techniques rather than initiating under the Baker Act. So this is just information that I felt important to share with you at this point. I do want to tell Haley again that she did a fabulous job, and I'm so honored to be on the program with her. I'm going to turn this back over, though, to Kim, because I think we actually have a number of questions that may
We do. Thank you so much, Martha, for that information.
Okay.
I appreciate it. Right now, I'm going to ask everyone who's a panelist to turn off their camera unless they're asked to ask a question. Well, actually, the opposite. I'm going to ask Haley and Martha to turn on theirs because the questions will be directed towards both of you. And I'm going to leave mine.
I'll take care of that.
Okay.
Okay, and I'm going to leave mine off. And the reason why I'm going to leave my video off is so I can read the mini questions. So if you haven't, you should be able to check your Q&A function at the bottom and add a question. So far, we have a couple of them, and I'm just going to go backwards at this point and just make sure we try to address as many questions. I'm going to start with one from our president who had to get off the line, but was very intrigued and pleased with the presentation. What steps should higher education institutions take to improve their work with adult learners who are autistic? And I believe that's for you, Haley.
Oh my God. Thank you, Dr. Williams. This is a great question. And the more I think about it, the more my views have changed. So I wrote about autism in college when I was a freshman. And now that I'm out of grad school or law school, whatever you want to call it as well, I have so many different feelings. And I think a lot of it comes down to making learning as accessible as possible, because a lot of the challenges that I had were mostly independent living and things like that. But I think that in terms of the learning environment, that even how we present information. So whenever I teach, because I still sometimes get to teach classes or guest lecture, I try to make sure that my information is accessible both as a speaker and lecturer and even what's on slides, so that people don't feel like they're lost in some way, or be able to present information in more than one way, or make it that deadlines are pretty well spelled out. So I think it's really important to work on those things and know what the weaknesses are so that we can combat them as a team. and that you can work with students in that regard. And also just don't be afraid to check in with us as people. And again, you don't have to modify the content of what you're teaching in higher ed, but it's just how it's presented. So I saw this even when I was in law practice, which wasn't quite the same as being in the classroom, but even that, something that I think can apply is the first time I was assigned to do a motion, I had no clue what to do. I just sat there and I was like, yeah, I'll do it. And then I ended up staring at the wall for 4 hours because I just had no clue. But if it was broken down of write the statement of facts, write this, then research the argument, and even just doing that on separate little deadlines made it that I was able to get the whole thing done instead of just feel overwhelmed by the go write this 20-page thing. So if you're assigning assignments like research papers, that might be a great way to make it that a neurodivergent student doesn't feel completely overwhelmed at the prospect of having to do this really big project as well. So we can definitely talk further about this because there's so much, I think, to get into on the idea of working with students and also how to better accommodate us and have access for all kinds of learners. Because again, I think all kinds of learners need the support that they can. So some of us are visual learners, some of us are auditory learners. It doesn't matter who you are. It's just getting that information out and digestible to the greatest amount of people in your classes.
Okay, I want to jump over to Vicki Westra, who was our speaker last year, and forgive me, this is a new format for me too, so questions are just popping up and it scrolls. Vicki says, Haley, you are what we call a true shifter for autism. You are an example of what's possible for individuals with autism, and I love the fact that you felt good about the diagnosis as you grew up. But what advice would you give to our autism population who are not feeling so good about who they are?
First off, acceptance, I think, is a very personal journey. So there are times that I've had that doubt of like, oh, I kind of wish that I was neurotypical in this way or that. So I think acceptance is very personal across all disabilities generally, is that people who have different conditions will come to terms with it very differently. Sometimes you grieve, sometimes you wish you weren't. But for me, acceptance is something I grew up with, and I think it's important for us to focus on the strengths. So every child, especially when I talk about children, we know what we're bad at, right? Like we all know if we're not that good at math or whatever it might be, but we all know the strengths. And I think it's really important to remind people and praise them at the things that they're good at. So when I first heard about my diagnosis, so I was diagnosed at 3, I found out at 9 that we spent a lot of time focusing on the things I was good at. So my mom and dad were like, you're a really talented artist. You're a great writer. You have an amazing memory. You're so sensitive and empathetic towards other people. And we didn't focus on the fact that you eat 3 foods, you can't make friends, or you're not very good at keeping friends. You're kind of, and I never felt like I was awkward or weird or anything because I just thought all these things were normal and great. It made me who I was. So I think it's really important to focus on the strengths and especially the things we're interested in. So in a previous lecture, somebody had a chat with me about like, how do I feel because my 22-year-old is interested in like My Little Pony or something that didn't seem age appropriate. And I'm like, so what? Age appropriate is something we assign, and we should make them feel good about the fact that they're so passionate about something as long as it's not, legitimately inappropriate or harmful to somebody else or themselves. So if your thing is maybe like punching people, that's probably bad. But if it's something like My Little Pony, not so much. So it's really important, I think, to focus on the strengths and to also encourage those interests and things that we enjoy as well, because they bring us more than just comfort, that they bring us joy, or they could be jobs, or they could be so many other things. So I often get this in terms of video games. I'd sometimes feel like, oh, maybe I'm too old for like Pokemon or whatever. And I'm sitting there like, no. 1, video games influence my artwork. 2, they're really fun. And 3, they make me feel calm. So I see no issue. So keep doing you.
That's a great segue to one of the next questions from Eddie. Haley, how do you deal with sensory overload in your work?
Sensory overloads are hard. So any of you who've ever seen a meltdown or have had that, just know as hard as it is on you, it's really hard on us too. So for me, I know what triggers sensory overloads for me is usually loud and crowded spaces and jazz music. It's always the saxophone for anybody who wants to know what it is about jazz music that makes me freak out. If you're a jazz musician, I love you and I respect you and know that you're incredibly talented. It's just probably not for me because it will make my senses freak out. But that aside, I know how to deal with sensory overloads for me. It's usually escape to somewhere quiet. I usually want to be alone because then I get overwhelmed thinking about how this is affecting somebody else. Again, the stereotypes that we don't have feelings or might not be empathetic or complete lies. So I always want to be alone when I feel overwhelmed or overloaded because I don't want to, I feel guilty and fall into this like shame spiral type thing where I feel bad that other people feel bad or helpless because I'm overwhelmed. And then I feel overwhelmed thinking that they're overwhelmed because I'm overwhelmed. So for me, just letting me get through it, because if meltdowns and sensory overloads happen because your body is fighting the input around you. The best way to kind of explain this experience is if you've ever been into the electronics aisle of like Walmart or Target and you see all the TVs on and they're all on different channels and the volume is up on every single one of them. And then I ask you, go focus on one of them and pay attention to that one specific television with that one program on it. And you're like, this is a lot. And it's like, yeah, I experience that almost everywhere I go. I know that feeling very, very well. So try to just be empathetic, and every person reacts differently as well. So that's kind of my advice, and that meltdowns and sensory overloads are scary for everybody. They're not fun, but having good coping strategies makes it less terrible.
Thank you so much. I have a question from Jordan Jackson, who happens to be my other daughter. It's a college student. How do those who are not in a high up profession or the leader of a profession help to facilitate the acceptance of neurodivergent people in the workplace and even in our college environments? And did you feel any pressure to enter graduate study or further education at all?
I don't know if I felt pressure. I think I put a lot of pressure on myself. So that's something I was actually talking with my mom about earlier today, is I feel like I put a lot of pressure knowing how much my parents put into my success and me as a person, and how much they have sacrificed in their own careers and their own desires and things in their lives too. And I'm like, I feel pressure to do a really good job in life generally, because I don't want to feel like your sacrifice and what you did for me wasn't ever worth it. And of course, my parents like, that's crazy that you think that way. But I do realize I put a lot of pressure on myself because I want to succeed. I don't want to give in to these stereotypes of that we can't do something. I'm so afraid to feel like I failed. But I think that's normal for a lot of us. And I'm really glad that you care a lot about being a good ally. I think that's really important. So even if you're not neurodivergent yourself, there's so much you can do to support us, whether it's being friends with us or if you work at a company, something. I always think it's important to get in on the diversity and inclusion committees and things like that. I know for the Florida Bar, I'm doing my best to join the D&I committees and things like that, because I know our incoming president has a daughter on the spectrum as well, and her daughter's a very good friend of mine. So I'm like, we need to make sure that people who are neurodivergent are represented in the discussions that bar leadership has, for instance. And sometimes having an ally say these things can be more powerful than we are, because when we say it, sometimes it's like an echo chamber, right? But when someone else amplifies our voices or passes the mic or holds the mic, we get a lot further. So your commitment to this means a lot too. And just including people in your leadership in the activities you do goes really far too. So something that I always think about, at least when I was in college, was the Greek system, right? And I think it would have been really meaningful if, for instance, like a sorority chapter had went out on a limb and made sure to include people, and not just as like buddies to make them feel good to get community service hours. Because a lot of people would volunteer with those kinds of organizations to get service hours or to make their chapters look good. It's like, it would be a lot more meaningful if you genuinely liked us as people and had us as members of your chapters, for instance. So there's so many ways to get involved and to also elevate us and include us. So this is, again, I feel like a lot of these questions I can have a much longer conversation, but I want to get through as many questions as humanly possible as well, and also leave time for Martha to answer questions about the Baker Act, because she was incredible too. So we can always talk further after this is over too. So I hope that helps a little bit on allyship and pressure.
Okay, with that being said, I am going to toss the question to Martha, but we will stay on a little bit longer to make sure that we have questions answered. Haley, if you will do me a favor, because you have access to go into the Q&A, you can also type questions, answers, type them answers.
I will do that. Should I mute myself as well?
Yes. Lisa Gould has a question about college. I want to give a shout out to her. She's one of our accessibility assistant coordinators, which I'm sure I said that title wrong. She is outstanding and one of the seminal persons who worked with me on creating Autism Awareness Day. Beatrice Mexon, I'm sure I'm saying your name wrong too. My apologies if I didn't pronounce it correctly. She is with Lift Academy, which is one of our wonderful achieving schools in the community that address all disabilities, not just with autism. We have people from around the coast, including friends and family of mine who work with college students, and they have questions as well. And then my mother, her name is Jerry Griffey. Please answer her question because she will continue to type them. And so now I want to do a question with Martha Lenderman. What would you recommend to families about the stigma of the Baker Act and how to cope with the ramifications of having it on their medical records?
Well, I think the primary thing I always say is stigma is alive and well, and it's one of the most, I think a diagnosis of mental illness is probably as devastating as any that a person can have in terms of the way in which they are treated by the public and even sometimes by their own families and even by treating professionals. So all I could say would be take time to learn about mental illness. It is a medical diagnosis. It's a disease of the brain. And try to get your information from reliable sources because there's a lot of misinformation out there. And to do a lot of work in terms of reducing stigma once you do learn about mental illness, take an active role in that, and to advocate for improved funding. What I didn't mention earlier is that Florida, the state of Florida, is 49th or 50th, depending on the source that you see, in terms of funding from community mental health and community substance abuse services. And so when we criticize the service system, there's good reason for that, why it can't be as responsive as the professionals may want it to be. I want to go back for a moment and to address something that Haley so beautifully remarked on is talk to us if there's a mental illness. There's an old phrase in the disability community saying, not about us, without us. And I think that's crucial. And when we talk about people with mental illnesses, that we incorporate them in the discussion of what kind of treatment do they want and when do they want it. I'm a huge believer in advance directives where people can actually identify in advance of any kind of a crisis what kind of services they want and where they want them to take place. And so all that can help to reduce that stigma and give people a sense of more control over their own life and circumstances.
I have another question, and this is from a parent. Can you explain what parents should do if faced with a child in the Baker Act with little resources?
Well, I would like to comment, and I think probably most people here today are related to Pinellas County in some ways, and we do have one public receiving facility, PEMS, which is grossly underfunded for the impossible task they have. But PEMS has been very involved in working with the Agency for Persons with Disabilities, and they have an individual staff member by the name of Kristen Ryan. And I hope that she might be on here today because she's been addressing the needs of people with autism who end up Baker Acted and are left on the crisis units, and sometimes for a rather extended period of time. And so she actually goes with families to various facilities to try to find ones that will not only suit the needs of the individual, but the families as well, and kind of work through that whole system. And I'm not sure exactly what it is, but she actually was chosen to chair an autism committee recently. And this is from a mental health provider. And that I'm very pleased about because she is a wealth of information, and PEMS can help. And PEMS, while they are required to charge people fees, it's all on a sliding fee basis. If they have no insurance and they have very limited funds, they're going to end up having no fee there at all. However, if they have the ability to pay, the law requires that they be charged. So the access to funding should not be an issue. And hopefully the services provided will be appropriate to their actual diagnosis once the examination is performed. And if they don't have co-occurring disorders, then hopefully they will be released, if there's a place to release them to, as quickly as possible. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but I do know that we do have, particularly at the public receiving facility, some knowledge and skill in trying to navigate that system.
Well, thank you, Martha. I would like to say to everyone, who's on, because some of you all I can see as participants and some of you all I know just logged on with the Zoom link, that we're going to stay on for another 10 minutes, if that's okay, and have questions answered. And of course, if you have to log off, we understand. Our time frame was 2 p.m. today, but we appreciate the opportunity, and we have a rare opportunity to work with Haley and Martha to get these questions answered. While they are going through the questions, I just want to, again, thank everyone who has to log off. And I want to thank particularly my ISPS team. That would be Jacqueline Schuett, that you don't see. She is our project coordinator. Sharon Panow, that you also don't see. She's our senior administrative assistant. And Kyle Bell, who we have hired to navigate the system of Zoom. We had to change a program quickly from a face-to-face modality to a virtual modality, and it's just been wonderful to work with everyone, including the esteemed panelists, to get this done. So I want to thank you. So for those of you all who want to sign off, we understand all of the links and all of the presentations are listed on our website, solutions.spcollege.edu. Again, solutions.spcollege.edu. We're going to hang on, and I'm going to say my formal goodbye before we start answering more questions. 1 second, ladies. So again, I want to thank you for your time and for your participation with our first Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions program. My apologies for the earbuds. As I said, I have an autistic student here at home who is now homeschooled in light of the coronavirus. I can't thank you all enough for attending, for all the people who have advocated, supported, educated, enlightened, accepted, or are just coming to that understanding. I thank you. It's an important conversation. We will continue to promote our programs for ISPS on our Facebook page and on our website, so stay tuned, and thank you. For those of you who are staying after, please remain on, and Haley and Martha, for the extent you can, please remain on to answer questions. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely. I've been going through some of the questions. So some of you I might have typed a reply to, and some of you I will probably also follow up, because some of you ask me for things like links and resources. I've actually been trying to put together a resource guide slowly. So if we answer each other's questions, just also hang out, because depending on the question, I might have a link or something to be able to drop in for more information, so we don't take up too much time on one question. So how do you want to go through the rest of the questions, Kim? Do you want me to read some of them, or?
Yes, yes, because you know which ones you answered and which ones you didn't, and that'll be helpful. And Kyle, if you can dismiss them as we go through, so that we know we don't have any questions that are repetitive. I know that Kimberly Dorman, I believe with Creative Clay, is on. She has a question. I don't know if you were able to get her, because some of the questions are also on the chat as well as Q&A. So why don't you start, and whatever you don't get, then I will make sure that I'm keeping track to help.
Okay.
And Kimberly, real quick. Yes, everything will be in the Q&A, and I've been copying the questions from the chat over to the Q&A, so I'll dismiss them as we cover them.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you so much. So Jerry asks about being told that I was autistic by my parents and how I told my peers and classmates. So I was told at 9, and I told I used to tell friends kind of on a case-by-case basis, or when I felt comfortable, but eventually I actually got outed by my freshman English teacher, because I was doing an art show and I had proceeds going to benefit my local autism organization. And when I gave him the flyer, he asked me to talk about it in front of the class, and he asked me why the proceeds were going there. And not being a very good liar, I'm a little bit too honest for my own good, I explained that I was autistic, and that's kind of how I came out to everybody. I actually will link you to something as well, because I wrote about this experience a little bit more in depth, and how it was actually probably one of the better things that happened to me, even though everyone thinks that being outed in some way is kind of bad. It wasn't for me. It actually changed my life for the better. I wrote about it for Teen Vogue, and I'm happy to link that as well. I was actually working on pulling that up before it was time to transition to answering them in live time. So let me actually send that. I will send that to you as a typed answer, so all of you can read that as well. So hopefully that helps. Okay. So that question's taken care of. Our next question is, okay, let me see that we haven't answered or something before, is Beatrice asks what my biggest challenge was when I arrived as a freshman in college. and how I overcame that and what advice I have for other individuals on the spectrum who are leaving home or college or moving out. So let me preface this with I've never lived alone in any which way, shape, or form when I got to college. So when I say that, I literally never even went to like sleepaway camp, okay? I went to maybe 2 sleepovers my entire life, and I was the first one to leave. Like, my experience of living independently was very little. And I wish that I had had more experience with actual like independent living tasks. So things like laundry, because the first time I did laundry in college, I put everything in the dryer and wondered why it came out all hot and soapy at first, which is kind of laughable. I know most of you have probably been like, that's kind of silly, but yeah, that happened to me. And I think it's really important that we spend more time on life skills, because in college, when I look back, the things that I struggled with were mostly life skills and friendships, which also will segue into probably another question or two as well. But those home skills are things that they don't teach in school. I also did very well academically. So I wish that we had spent more time on that. And that's something that I'm still working on overcoming and working with. And I realize that it's okay to ask for help. And something that I've been getting better about learning as time goes on is independence does not mean you have to do it all by yourself. So being independent also means knowing when it's okay to ask for help and when you acknowledge that you need it, because that's brave and part of being an adult. It doesn't mean you have to do everything by yourself and not depend on your parents or even ask an RA for help or anything else as well. So just kind of an aside when it comes to independence and college generally. Okay, let me see which other ones might be fun to answer. So Grace asks what suggestions for enriching learning environments and accommodating for diagnosed students, and realizing that education has been very traditional for decades, and how do we reframe that? So this is also kind of why, as much as this coronavirus thing is very scary, and with homeschooling things are mixed, and I also worry about students with the IDEA 504 and the ADA under this as well, but I think it's hopeful to see different learning styles coming into effect. I think it's important to recognize as in the public school system what rights students have under the IDEA, what can go into an IEP. I think it's important, if possible, and usually this sounds like a bold move when I say it, because a lot of parents don't always agree with me on this, is I say that your children should, if they're old enough to understand, they should be part of their own IEP meetings, because the IEP is ultimately about them and their education, and their goals might not be the same as the goals that you have for them. So I was in private school, but the meetings we'd have with my teachers every year were really important. And I would go to those meetings and eventually realize that some of my goals weren't what everyone else had too. So some of the goals I would have were just making friends, or I want a friend who's a girl, because all my friends were boys growing up. So even getting to say, I would like to be friends with the girls this year at one of those meetings as maybe a 10-year-old was really powerful to say. So I think it's really important that we include students in their own conversations if possible. If they're able to, find different ways to communicate, presume competence. So again, not speaking is not the same as nothing to say. And as Martha mentioned earlier as well, the phrase in the disability community, nothing about us without us, is really important. And as public school administrators and teachers, you can start grooming some of those self-advocacy skills that I wish got taught at home more often by parents as well. But I think it's possible to teach those at home and have them encouraged and used in school too. Okay, we have there are a lot of questions. I realize we have more questions keep coming in, so.
Yes, if you want to take a break and start writing for some of them.
Let's do that, because I know
okay.
that, let's do that, because some of these I think might be quicker to write out, because I usually like to talk a lot.
Okay. And to the extent, Martha, that you and I can answer them, let's just try. So I'm going to go backwards, because that way I can see what you may have answered. Do you have advice for those who do not communicate verbally to help them to acquire that skill? Or do you have advice for educators who want to support the people with autism they work with to access their voice? And then these are both from Kimberly Dorman. And I know it was a long time ago, but do you remember what it was like when you went from not being able to communicate to verbally to being able to express yourself verbally? Was it a gradual process? And Haley, before you respond to that, I wanted to also give accolades to Creative Clay. It's a wonderful organization in our community, which deals with many people on the spectrum of varying disabilities. And it's a challenge because she has many programs going in and out for adult learners all day long there. with significant support, but still it's a challenge. So I think the questions are coming from that space when you have a diverse space. The verbal transition to the nonverbal transition rather to the verbal transition can be challenging for people. So any advice?
So I was young, but I think that what happens, and I realize this with people that I know who are non-speaking or have been non-speaking longer, is a lot of it is a frustration. So it's not that you don't want to speak or not be able to express yourself. It's being understood in a way that makes sense to everybody involved. So I have friends that are still non-speaking and they type everything out on an iPad or something. And honestly, saying that they're not smart or anything is like the worst thing you could do, because some of these people have far more wisdom and far more grace and far more intelligence than I ever will. So I really just want to throw that out, number one. And at least for me, I don't know what it was like to be nonverbal. All I remember is really just wishing that I could express myself in certain times, and also just, it was a gradual process. So I had PT, I had OT, I had different speech therapies as well growing up. And I think generally it has definitely been gradual because I wasn't very good at asking for things. I feel like I still kind of struggle with that, actually, is I hate asking for things. And I think it's also because there's a shyness to me, and also because in a weird way, I think most of us might have this too, is we struggle with rejection or the idea of someone saying no, even though there are far worse things that can happen than somebody saying no to you for any reason. But I guess I get self-conscious and always have. So I was always very quiet in school. So that's kind of an interesting thing to take, and nobody believes me when I say I was like the quietest kid in the class, but I was. So I wish I remembered more, and I think it's really important, again, to presume competence, and I wish I had more answers for you on that question.
Okay, well, I want to now follow up with former superintendent, Dr. Grace Wright, and she's, this is also my aunt, a family member in support, and she wanted to talk about the public school system. What suggestions do you have to assist public school administration in accommodating and providing enriching learning environments for diagnosed students, recognizing that the educational system has been practiced in a traditional manner for decades? How do we now reframe delivery?
Oh, I like that question a lot. I think I was actually starting to answer that one over text as well. I can't remember if I did or not, but I have a lot of feelings about this because I love education law. I think it's really interesting stuff. So again, as we know, we have IEPs and IDEA and all that stuff too. And I think with providing enriching learning environments, one, presume competence. So just because someone's non-speaking, it doesn't mean you have to teach them at like a third grade level, even when they're in high school, for instance. And I think just the way that what we teach is really important. And also, like I mentioned, for college teachers and administrators, I think even with younger students, it's important to provide information in as many different formats as possible, because again, we have all kinds of learners. I was always very visual. So whenever people would just straight talk at me, I'd be like, what? Or if it was just too visual, then somebody gets left behind that needs to hear that information, or if someone needs to learn by doing. So sometimes I need to like mess up in order to understand why something is or isn't the way that it is. I think we all learn from our mistakes, as they say. So I think there's many different ways to accommodate and provide different learning, and also be aware of your students' strengths as well. So sometimes even, I remember getting at one point as really like crushing it in the math and the spelling stuff when I was little, and I would get more challenging work just because it was like, you know what you're doing, you don't need this, you need something to stimulate your learning on top more so than some of the other students. So that would be okay too. And I think we need to take more of an approach that I wish that we taught more life skills, especially in special education or with students overall. I know as an adult, probably one of the most enriching lessons we had when I was in high school is I remember we did a lesson in algebra on like tax day, and we learned how to like file taxes. Like we learned how to do like a 1040 form. And I was like, why don't they teach? And now that I'm an adult, I like wish I paid attention that day, right? And of course I'm like, because you know, you're not like thinking about doing a 1040 when you're 15, but when you're 26 or 25, you're like, what even do I do? Like I'm trying to figure that stuff out on my own at this point too, is some of that like adult skill stuff. So learning adult skills, I think not only for people with disabilities, but for all students could be beneficial. So with my approach to education, I like to follow the curb cut effect. So what can benefit the most marginalized can benefit everybody. So this happens a lot with our sidewalks. So you know how they have those like little curves cut into them, that it benefits both like us walking on the sidewalk, and it also helps it so it's more accessible for people in wheelchairs as well. So it's kind of that, is that what benefits the most marginalized could benefit everybody. I know even with us doing remote learning right now and remote work, this has been something that people with disabilities have been pushing for a very long time, and we've been denied that. And now that it's accessible to everybody, everybody is able to benefit in some way. Like some of us do better working in our own space, and people like us have wanted this because maybe someone who has a physical disability can't physically move that day, for instance. So I think we need to take it from that bottom up approach, is how do we serve the people who struggle the most, and eventually how is it going to benefit literally everybody. So I think there's a way to help everyone, and much wider conversation, but again, definitely keep people's rights in mind, because IDEA is what applies most in public schools along with the ADA.
I want to respect time, especially Kyle's, and I'm going to make one comment and then try to combine 3 questions. The first is, there was a question asked regarding, could we make this a CEU and a CLE, and our rapid time to try to transition from the face-to-face to the virtual, we have not applied, and I will ask Martha for assistance with that. There's some healthcare providers on the phone, Martha, who had some questions about that, and maybe Haley can assist with making it a CLE. So to address that, from the educational standpoint, Haley, it looks like, and I'll let you type your answer when you have time or follow up with them, but it looks like the 3 questions combined are from Lisa Gould, Lisa Benson, and Dr. Annette Wright-Smith. And they're about like the transition from high school, prepping for high school. Do you see an increase in promotion of students on the spectrum into a college system, which they may not be necessarily prepared for? And how are you helping with preparing them for these, how do you foresee autistic students being prepared for IEP or for standardized tests in general?
So I was actually answering the question about standardized tests, because I did all my law review research on standardized tests because I'm a nerd, and I love how, and also all those tests used to discriminate against disabled test takers in some way or form. So again, this is where it's really important for those of you who do have diagnoses to be able to have record of that, so you can get accommodations such as extra time or a quiet room or any of that kinds of stuff that might be helpful. This is something I've researched in depth, mostly in the higher ed sphere and post-secondary, and even like post-college, because things kind of drop off really rapidly once you're no longer protected under IDEA or anything of that nature too. So standardized tests are a whole other thing. I think another really great place for students with disabilities to shine, and whether is on college application essays, because it's a time that you could also talk about overcoming different obstacles and adversity. Like I know I wrote about my own journey for my law school essays. I talked about not just being an inspiration, and basically that about having a voice as a person with a disability, and why for my law school personal statement, I'm always happy to send my essays, because people always ask me like what I wrote about, and I'm always very happy to share those with you because they're so unique to my own experience. You probably can't steal it anyway, but I'm very happy to share some of that stuff. And navigating high school and finding the right place. I went to 3 middle schools in 3 years. I was mostly in the private school system. Finding the right school is finding the mix of somewhere that I was academically challenged and also wasn't going to get bullied and other things like that too. So the school I ended up at for high school, I was very challenged. I didn't really have a lot of friends, but I was able to make friends. And there was a variety of different options of things that I enjoyed. So I was really involved in the art program. I was involved in student journalism. So I was on the newspaper for 4 years. I was president of the art club. I did all sorts of things like that. I was not an athlete. I wish I was. I tried to join the crew team. I went to the summer training camp and I passed out the first day on the water. So that was the end of my college athletic career. Not my college, my high school athletic career. So I tried. At least it was available to me. It just wasn't something that I was meant to do. But I also think in the private school system, like where I went to school, I don't think there were that many students with disabilities. Don't quote me on that, but I feel like I was probably one of a few. So it was definitely a very different experience because I wasn't a mainstream school. I also am not the best at developing friendships, for those of you who've asked about that stuff. And I also do think that there is a swing in promoting higher ed for students on the spectrum, which is a good thing, I think. But also, if higher ed is not something that they're passionate about pursuing or don't want to pursue, that's okay too. I think that's how it is for most students, is we have to understand what they're good at, what they want to do, and accept that. And I think with more students wanting to go into higher ed, that's wonderful. And I think that's where we need to work on post-secondary options and beyond college with employment and things like that, because we do have a lot of college grads coming out that are on the spectrum but not having those employment options. So it's kind of a very multifaceted thing. Is at first it's let's get all these kids to college, because when I was going to college there was no resources by autistic people for autistic people going to college, and now it's all these people graduated that are like my age, and they're all like, so jobs, and now we're talking about jobs for people who went to higher ed. So I think the push into higher ed is a good thing in that regard, but we need to move forward with that too, and to make sure that we're giving experiences, and also that if you do want to go into a trade or something that doesn't require higher ed, that we give that support as well.
Okay, well, with that, we're going to have to end our program. I think you have Haley's pledge that she's going to follow up to the extent she can with all the questions. And I'd like a favor. Again, my exceptional team has worked really hard at promoting this and getting this information out.
Thank you, everyone.
One thing that we've learned is that everyone interfaces differently, whether it's through texting, emailing, websites, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. So if you will, when we send out our exit survey, if you will kindly fill it out so that we know the best way to reach you and the best way we can promote our future events with you, we'd certainly appreciate it. Again, I want to thank Martha for your time. Haley, I'd like to thank you for your time. Kyle, thank you. And of course, our exceptional ISPS team. And I wish you well. Happy World Autism Day.
Thank you so much. And happy World Autism Awareness Day to everyone here. And let's make that push from awareness to acceptance.
Yes.